over to Laura Jean and begin our discussion. Laura Jean, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and especially Dr. Roberts, thank you for joining us and being willing to speak with us this evening about your book, The Cedar Choppers.
Glad to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, would you like to start telling us a little bit about your experiences with this book, and then we've got some slides to show you all, and after he finishes with his talk, I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So, Dr. Roberts, please take it away.
Okay. Well, it's fun to be here, and like talking about the Cedar Choppers. Any of you who are non-Texans may not relate to this quite as well, but this is a hill country story, essentially. It took place around Austin, but also down San Antonio, New Braunfels, anywhere along the Balcones Escarpment. So I grew up in Austin in the mid-1950s. It was a really different town. As you know, it's very hip now. It's a very different town then. It was more like a Waco than a Houston or Dallas, sort of any sort of medium-sized town with suburbs, with little houses and neat yards. It had the Capitol and the university, but it was still a quiet town back then, with minority of African Americans and even fewer Hispanics. There were a few signs of any real money. But what made Austin so unique in Texas was that it lay right on the fault. The Balcones Fault is the dividing line between the South and the West. Literally, there was a huge uplift of land, and then it was washed away. And so right on the Colorado River, the land was pushed up and washed away, and there were high mountains and deep ravines. It was cut by rushing creeks. Past where I lived in West Austin on Exposition Boulevard, if any of you guys are familiar with Austin, I trapped coons there to make a little extra money because it was all woods. We kids back then grew up in a totally different time. We had the run of West Austin, Terrytown on a bicycle from our elementary school at Cassis to the boat docks down on Lake Austin to Lamar Boulevard. We thought we were tough. There was never any real reason to go west of the Balcones Fault, to go into the hot, dry hills. It was the 1950s, and there was a serious drought. It was never really said, but that was no man's land. Next slide. Hello?
Yes.
There we go.
There we go.
Hi. That is Edna Patterson. And she is standing in front of her little house on Bee Caves Road, which is now the most expensive subdivision or zip code in the whole Austin area. And we would drive past there. My sister would ride horses up on Redbud Trail, up on Bee Caves Road, and we would pass by this house. And she would say, "Do you know that like 15 people live in that house?" And I go, "No, that's not possible, But it was true. Later, I went to O. Henry with the youngest of her children, Luther Pierce. She was, by the way, lived until the 1970s and cooked on a wood stove her entire life. So I'm going to read a few sections from the book at different times. And let me start with the section from the book. The first chapter, first page, really. Back in the 1950s, one of my favorite ways to spend a few hours was to ride my bike down to the low water bridge below the dam and go fishing. I could usually catch enough bluegills and bass for dinner, and sometimes even a catfish. One afternoon when we were 10 or 11, my neighbor Dudley and I rode out there to fish. When we got off our bikes and scrambled down from the road with our poles, 3 boys were standing in the middle of the path. I remember how different from us they looked. They were barefoot, their pants were too short, their shirts were ragged, and they looked hard, tanned, skinny, dirty. These were not kids you would see in Austin. In a few years, we would go to O. Henry Junior High, which had opened just right across the low water bridge from where they lived, and we would see some of them in school. But before that, few went past the 7th grade at Eanes School, and they mostly stayed in the Cedar Hills on the other side of the Colorado River. The 3 kids we met were smaller than we were and looked younger. They stood abreast, held up a stringer of bluegills, and one said in a hard, flat voice, "You want to buy some fish?" I was speechless. We were going fishing. If we didn't catch anything, we'd have a dinner waiting for us at home. It was about catching fish, not about eating them. But Dudley, who was a tough kid even back then, popped back. If we wanted to buy fish, we'd go to the HEB, which is a Texas grocery store. There was a long pause, and they turned around and left. I told Dudley, "I don't think you should have said that to those boys." Not because I was offended, but because I thought this level of disrespect would likely arouse a response. And sure enough, in a couple of minutes, they were back, and one of them was carrying a club. It was clear to me that whatever happened, we were going to lose. Dudley was strong and quick. With any normal West Austin kids, the odds would have been in our favor. But these were West Austin kids, and there was nothing normal about the look in their eyes. They were going to fight without rules until one or the other of us was badly hurt. So we ran. That was the first time I asked the question, who are these people? It wouldn't be the last. Yeah, so I went to write this book, and I couldn't believe that nobody had done anything on it because they were so fascinating. This subculture out there in the hill country of Texas. Who were these people? So I started doing some research. They were a subculture unique to the hill country of Texas who cut cedar post to hang barbed wire on, and that wire was used to fence the West. Most of the West was fenced off after World War II because there was no more labor to work on the farms, and it was turned to cattle, and these were the posts that hung the wire that fenced the West. The families, I found out, came from Appalachia in the last few decades of the 19th century. They were Scots-Irish, like Braveheart, who were transported from Scotland to Ireland to take the land of the Irish. In the late 18th century, they migrated to Pennsylvania. The only people that would let them in were the Quakers in Pennsylvania because they were accepting of all sorts of people. The Puritans certainly didn't want them, and the planters down in the South didn't want them either. They were twice removed, if you want to think of it that way. First from Ireland, and then first from Scotland, and then from Ireland. David Hackett Fisher, who wrote a wonderful book called Albion's Seed, called them a double distilled selection of some of the most disorderly inhabitants of a deeply disordered land. From Pennsylvania, they moved right across the good Lancaster County farmland that's farmed by the Amish now. They weren't farmers. They flowed down through Appalachia, the Ozarks. They were always moving, several times in a lifetime, usually. From right there, they came west to Texas, crossed I-35, the good farmland east of I-35, and past that was West Texas, called the Llano Estacado, the Great Plains. They couldn't go any further. There was no wood, no water, no game. There was nothing for a mountain boy. They were standing on the edge of nothing, which is the subtitle of my book. The hill country west of the Balcones Fault became Texas Appalachia. Okay, Laura, let's kind of 3 slides here, or 4 slides here of this is a worm fence in Appalachia. Next is a worm fence in the hill country of Texas. Next slide. Hi, Laura. Got 4 slides here, Laura.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. Just right one after. Sorry. This is a barn in Appalachia. You can see the construction level. And next is a cabin in the hill country of Texas. Okay. One more. And you can see the similarity in the construction. Back maybe one. That's all. Okay. Okay, so yeah, there we go. And next. Next slide, please. This is Ronnie Roberts, to whom I dedicated the book. He was a cedar chopper and a firefighter, and he was one of my very first people that I interviewed. Basically, I interviewed over 50 cedar choppers, ranchers, and people who dealt with them. And Ronnie was one of the first. And I remember sitting on his back porch, and I'd been told by this guy who helped me do oral interviews that I shouldn't directly ask the real questions I wanted to ask, which were about what were you like? What was it like to be treated like you were treated? You know, what was it like to see the people of Austin, etc. He said, talk about the industry, talk about cutting cedar. And so I was into that about 15 minutes on his back porch. And Ronnie said to me, Ken, slow down a minute. Let's just talk. Let me tell you a little bit about my life. He said, next, please. He said, there we go. That's Ronnie on the left and his older brother on the right and his dad, Cecil Roberts, with a load of cedar. And they had a cedar yard in Hunt, Texas, which is near Kerrville. And his dad was a deacon in the Baptist church. And his big brother there died of a brain tumor just a couple of years later than this. His mother went into deep depression. His dad started drinking. His mom committed suicide. And they moved in with the grandparents. I was just floored by this experience, by talking to him and it changed my whole perspective. I couldn't beat around the bush. I was messing around with people's lives, and these stories were important to them, and I had to get it right, and I had to listen to what they had to say. So this was a huge bright light that sort of guided my research from then on. Next picture. This is the Roberts clan. I divided the cedar choppers into 4 clans, and they were in different parts of Austin. They were all on the creeks because they got their water from the creeks. None of them dug wells. This was Ronnie's granddad, Joe L. Roberts. For those of you who are visually impaired, Joe L. Roberts was blind in his later years and could put a car engine back together, spread the parts out on a tarp. He would find them, put them together, and rebuild that car engine. Next picture. This is his whole family. This is the there's his wife. That is Mary Patterson, the sister of Edna Patterson, who lived in the Little Rock house. And she's out there grading cedar post. You can see those are some pretty big posts. Next, please. And here's the whole family. The old man there is the grandfather, the patriarch of the clan. The man on the right is his son. The other guys are his sons. And so, next picture. So that is the Roberts T clan, I called them. Another clan, I'm just going to mention a couple of them. There's a few more in the book, two more in the book. This is Bull Creek, which is really one of the prettiest places west of Austin. It used to be you could drive on this little road and it would cross Bull Creek 4 or 5 times. Next picture. And I have a clan called the Bull Creek clan because there were a bunch of Cedar Choppers that lived at Bull Creek. I've never identified these people. I've always wanted someone in the audience to say, yeah, I know that one. This is a Bull Creek family. Next picture. So I was doing research, just talking to anybody that knew anything about Cedar Choppers. And I talked to this woman who had done an article in 1985 in Texas Highways. And she had a letter there, a handwritten letter from a woman. And let me read this to you, what that woman said. It was very interesting. She said, in 1936, Alan Lomax was a ethnomusicologist, and he went around and collected songs from all over the South, including Leadbelly and other people like that. Alan Lomax found a 3-generation family of charcoal burners out in the hills from Austin who were singing Elizabethan ballads very nearly as they had been sung in Elizabethan times. These people could not read or write, nor could they read music, of course, but they could play guitars and sing. They were real charmers, low-key with a marvelous sense of humor, and they were almost totally independent, living off what they made from charcoal burning, taking care of their own, and taking very little from the 20th century. So I thought that was a remarkable picture. It's titled A Mountain Woman in the Hills Near Austin. So I got really excited about the Lomax collection, and I talked to the curator several times and was trying to identify some of the people that they had interviewed to see if anybody was singing songs, but I didn't know their names at that point. Later on, I built a big family tree and I learned their names, and I actually have some of the songs recorded back then in the 1930s on the website, thecedarchoppers.com, if you want to listen to those. Quite remarkable. Next, please. Back there we go. So this is Mary Patterson, sister Edna married Lytton Pierce, and I went to O. Henry with their son, youngest son here, Luther Pierce. So Luther was he was the last person I interviewed, mainly because he was the only one that I actually knew when I was a kid, and I was afraid that he was going to wonder why I was interested or somehow have bad memories of back then. But he wasn't that. He was a very kind man, and I enjoyed talking to him a lot. Tell you a story at the end. But so everybody knew all the Cedar Choppers, whether they lived west of Austin, in the Bull Creek, or out Big Cave Road, in any of the areas. They all knew each other. And Ronnie Roberts said, I think I know Luther Pierce. And this is what he said. I thought you get a little bit about their whole attitude from this. He said, a few years ago, we lived in Oak Hill, which is out west of Austin, southwest of Austin. And I had some rock work done there. And this guy drove up with a load of rock. And I looked at him and I said, man, you look like a Patterson. Pattersons have a certain look. They have these little beady eyes. I said, man, you look like a damn Patterson. And this guy got out of his truck, and it was. I can't remember his name right now, but he was a Pierce. He had a rock quarry out there in Liberty Hill, somewhere in that area. And I couldn't believe it, man. It's like you could recognize it. Yeah. See them eyes, Guys, I have recorded all of these interviews, and you can listen to their voices, and they're quite remarkable. They don't talk like we used to talk. So, let me give you a little history. After the the first decades of the 20th century were really hard on people in the South. If you went to Central Texas back then, there were lots of little farms, 100 acres, 10 or 12, 20 acres in cotton. That was where they got their money. They raised pigs and stuff like that. The rural population was much greater than the urban population. But then you had bad prices, the boll weevil on cotton, the depression, and people just fled the farms. The rural South lost over 2 million people in the 1930s. The Cedar Choppers, however, were never farmers. They didn't grow cotton. They got their money from other things, burning charcoal, things like that. They were never prosperous farmers, and they survived these decades very much like they used to live. Go to the next slide, please. You'll see they grew a little corn for food. They and for feed for their pigs. They hunted. They fished. This is one of the guys I interviewed. It's an older man, much older man. Notice he's barefoot. And remarkable, holding a giant catfish. Next slide. But they also exploited cedar. Now, those of you who do live in the hill country know cedar to be a bush, essentially. This is old growth cedar. Like that. Look at that post to your right there, how straight and erect it is. You can make that a corner post in a fence and probably get 3 or 4 posts out of it. It's so tall. Next, please. One more slide. There we go. Look at this. This is a cedar post cut diagonally. That dark in the middle is called the heart. You can go back one. And that heart is absolutely impervious to insects, rot, to anything. When we moved to this ranch 50 years ago, there was a cedar fence surrounding it that was already old. The wire was already starting to rust out. And the cedar posts were still fine. And they're still fine now, but I had to build a new fence because the wire was all gone. And I just went to the coast fishing off of South Padre Island, and there was a cedar fence in the bay. And the posts were still there. I don't know how old they were, but this stuff is impervious. So rather than use trees in Colorado or wherever there were trees that could make fence posts out of, they imported this cedar from the hill country. Next, please. This is just some uses of cedar back then. It's an old smokehouse. You can see those posts are just hard as rock. Next. We got 4 here. That is a loading chute made of cedar post. You see these. The next one is fine. These fences are all over the hill country, and they're next one, and they're still good. There we go. Yeah. And I think there may be one more of those. Okay, but the problem was there are hard posts. Yeah, you couldn't go to that wagon. And that's how you had to get them out of the hill country. Well, it's rough land. I mean, you're not like going along the plains. So here's the guy hauling old cedar posts. There's probably 1,000 pounds of cedar post in that wagon. That's how you had to get them out. They'd float them down the Colorado River and did all sorts of things until the railroad came. That's another story. Next, please. So what they're looking for is a way to turn that cedar, which there is abundance of, into money. And selling the posts, they couldn't get them to market easily enough. So they did two things with them. The one here is what they did is they created charcoal with them. This is actually not in the hill country. This is in England. But these are charcoal burners. And what you do is you make a big pile of cedar posts and you cover it up with cedar shavings and then dirt. And you put a coal inside of it and you let it very, very slowly burn. And all of that wood turns into charcoal. And cedar made the very best charcoal. It burned extremely clean compared to, say, oak. It was used in the early 20th century to heat irons. If you've ever seen one of those irons, they put the cedar coals in and it burned clean and it didn't smell, didn't make the clothes smell or anything like that. So they did a lot of charcoal burning. Next. This is a opening of a still on Still House Hollow. It's a little park in the hills west of Austin. And that's what they really made their money off of. Moonshine. They had very clean water. The hill country streams run clean, pure, clear, excellent water to make moonshine with. They had a great place to hide it in the hills. And they basically, just the Bull Creek clan alone was producing about 100 gallons a month for Austin. One of the guys I talked to told me about his daddy, is actually named Dick Boatwright, famous moonshiner from the Bull Creek clan. And he would take a load into the Capitol and they'd see him come in and he had a disguise somehow as cedar post or something like that. And they take that out, take all that moonshine and sell it to the Capitol boys. So let me tell you a little story about Dick Boatwright. Next slide. This is Dick. So cool because I got some of these pictures after. Oh, these are moonshine trucks. They said they were cedar post trucks, but if you've ever seen a cedar truck, it's not nearly as in good shape as these trucks were. They were probably hauling moonshine in these trucks. Next, please. So this is Dick Boatwright of the Boatwright clan. So of the Bull Creek clan. So there was this deputy sheriff named Jim Sutton, and during Prohibition, they really tried to crack down hard on the moonshiners, and the Cedar Choppers were the moonshiners, all in the hills of Texas. They produced probably most of the moonshine that was consumed in the state at that time. And this deputy sheriff was named Jim McCoy, and he always wanted to be sheriff. Wore shiny boots, and he had a pearl handle revolver that he carried, big white hat. And Jim McCoy went up into Bull Creek, very much like I showed you earlier in that slide, and was going to look for Dick Boatwright, try to arrest him. And he comes on this kid who's, quote, sunning himself by the creek. I don't think of Cedar Chopper kids as trying to, catch a tan. I think they'd be tan enough as they are from working so hard. And he said, "Do you know Dick Boatwright?" And the kid said, "Yep, I know him." And he said, "Would you know where he lives?" The kid said, "Yeah, I know where he lives." Deputy sheriff's getting frustrated and says, "Well, will you take me there?" Kid says, "Yep, for $1." So, okay. Well, we go up there, we come back, I'll give you $1. Kid says, "You ain't coming back." So that is the story of Dick Boatwright. Apparently, when the train would come, it came pretty close to the Bull Creek clan. They would honk their horn, and the number of honks would tell them how many gallons of moonshine to bring to the station. So think back now. Again, you're in the 1940s. Your Austin is starting to develop much more rapidly, and there have been stories about these folks. stories about moonshine. There's been some bad bust. There's been some shootings, things like that going on. This newspaper article, they were called, they weren't called Cedar Choppers. That was a 50s term, maybe 60s even. It was a derogatory term, of course. They would call them unkempt mountaineers or hillbilly moonshiners. In a 1941 article marveled, and I'll quote it there, it said, within sight of the capital of Dome live people who depend on their water supply, on springs and creeks, speak a mountain dialect, and get their education with only a few months in a one-room school. Urban Austin had heard of them only in sensationalist newspaper stories of murder and mayhem and moonshine. But in the 1940s, things changed for them. And this is one of the things that I found out. Here, let's show you a couple of slides. What happened in the 1940s was, again, all those people left the land. All that farmland was turned to cattle, and all those cattle had to be fenced in. You couldn't let the cattle roam free on the roads. So you started to get an industry, a cedar chopper industry for cedar posts. These are big cedar posts. These would probably be corner posts. This is on a larger truck. You'd have a little truck, little terrible beat up truck, go into the breaks with the cedar choppers. They'd pull those posts out. They'd take them to a larger truck like this. Next slide. From there, they would take them to a cedar yard. And there were cedar yards up and down all the roads west of Austin. Highway 183, if you're familiar with that. Highway 71. There's a town called Cedar Park and Highway 183, right? It had 4 or 5 cedar yards in it. So there were cedar yards everywhere. And you could sell your post at any one of these yards. You independently contracted with the rancher to cut posts. He was probably happy to get rid of the post, to get some extra land, and you got the post for free or for not very much money, and you could then take them and sell them anywhere. And the price of a post went from a nickel to 25 cents within just a couple of years, a few years, because they were used all over the West. Next slide. Here they would then, that's from the cedar yard, that they would have take these long haul trucks, go up to Colorado, New Mexico, California, Louisiana. Next slide. So I wanted to show you just a few places. This is near Big Spring, Texas. You can see that is an axe cut. You can see the top of that. It's an axe made those points. You do that so it won't rot out. And that post is as good as it was when it was put in probably 50, 75 years ago. Next. I go to Colorado every summer, and I took this picture in the mountains of Colorado coming up. There we go. Look at that. Trees everywhere, wood everywhere. But no, they weren't cedar posts. They wouldn't last. So next slide. So this was the biggest revelation that I had. These guys, I'm not talking about this slide quite yet, but keep it there. These guys could make more money in a day than any other manual laborer. They could make, when the only job in the hill country, Cedar Park or something like that, was at the quarry, and you'd make less than $1 an hour. Even when I grew up, in the 1950s, $1.25 when I was in high school was a great salary. These guys could make $20 and up a day. I finally decided that they were, because they could sell their cedar post anywhere. They had no boss. They had no land. They had no capital. Nothing was at risk. They were the most independent men, working men in America at that time, I believe. They could sell their cedar post anywhere, and they made good money. I call this the heyday of the cedar choppers, the 1940s and the 1950s. Yet, look at this. This is Ronnie Roberts as a kid. This is where he grew up, and he had a floor, which is amazing. Some of them didn't have a floor. Next. They didn't change their lifestyle. these are the Gumberts. They are now in a tent because they're out of in the breaks cutting. They probably have another place that they live, but they lived in tents very commonly. Next slide. These guys coming up are T. No, this is another Patterson sister. We've seen two of them. This is Alice Patterson, a lovely woman who I interviewed, and she said they lived on a shack on Lake Austin, and didn't have a floor. And what floor they did have? One time they'd fall through it. This is her son in front of that shack, and one more of these just to show you. These are the only pictures of their houses that I have. I mean, these are the Teague boys. These are Homer Teague's kids. The kid on the right is Stonewall Jackson Teague, who's still alive and doing fine. And Thomas Jefferson Teague, I think, is the other kid. So I came to realize that these people grew up in such a different life than we did as kids in West Austin. The Balcones fault was not only a geographical thing, but it was a rift in time. East of Austin, east of the Balcones fault, Austin sort of always felt itself different than the rest of Texas, sort of an island of civility in the wilderness of Texas culture, if you will. And to the west of the Balcones fault was a transplant of Appalachia. These two cultures, were at opposite ends of a spectrum of civility. In my confrontation earlier, fishing was more like an encounter with a different people from another country or another time. We were much further apart than we could have imagined. Let me read you something here that I thought really captured well, because by this time, this is the story I'm telling. By this time, the story I'm telling is of this clash of cultures. And this is Elmer Bodie, who's a Texas writer from a few decades back. And he came from a hill country farm in Fredericksburg, Texas, and it went to the University of Texas. So he was no Cedar Chopper type guy. But when he came here, this is what he said. He found houses with lush lawns, and gold door knockers, and polished staircases winding to second floors. And the thoughts I had inside me burned so much like hot metal that all I wanted to do was yell out into the surrounding darkness. This is not my life here. I'm not of this world. I'm of a house that never had proper thing, where closet doors never shut, and faucets always dripped, and the dogs smelled a little like old grease. And in the hills west of Austin, of course, they didn't even have running water. I'm reading again, if a kid walked across the low water bridge into Terrytown, he would follow streets that were straight and clean and tree-lined, with white houses and green lawns and bright beds of flowers. The children there rode bicycles. And people went from house to house on sidewalks wearing nice clothes. If he walked up Exposition Boulevard to Windsor Road, he would pass a gas station and a grocery store and an air-conditioned pharmacy with a soda fountain. And next door, a toy store with a sleek replica of a passenger airline hanging in the window, something I always wanted for Christmas. To a Cedar Chopper kid, it was another world. When Don Simons, who I talked about earlier in the book, went with his dad on the regular Saturday moonshine run from Bull Creek to 6th Street, he would pass the golf course on Enfield. I would see all those guys out there with those white golf shoes on and golf shirts. Man, I wanted to play golf, he said. So I talked to one old guy named Bob Willis, who was in his 70s, and he was still hauling cedar all over Texas. And he said that one time outside of Houston, he had some food with him, and he wanted to pull off the highway, and he pulled into this area, and there were a bunch of shacks in there. And he said, when I seen that, I thought back when I was a little kid. He was a Cedar Chopper kid. And you look to the left, and that's what you'd see. But then you look to the right, and you'd see the city of Temple, I believe it was, not a big city. The high buildings and stuff down there, and I always thought we were so close to civilized country, but so far away. So that was the story I've been trying to capture in writing this book. Next, please. And so let's put ourselves back in the 40s, in the 50s. The Cedar Choppers are making money. They're moving into the farmers' houses who fled the land. They've got sometimes nice cars, you know. Yet, this is who they came. This is what they came across. The city people were looking at them as hillbillies, and they were hillbillies. So these are some of the cartoons of the time, way back. You can see that guy. Then there's Snuffy Smith, you know, always with his moonshine. Little Abner, Daisy May, and the woman on the right is named Moonbeam McSwine. I don't know if you guys remember that, but this is the image that they have of Cedar Choppers. They emerged and they stepped into this cultural stereotype, the age of the hillbilly. There were, I don't know how many TV shows, Gomer Pyle, etc., you know, the Beverly Hillbillies, you know, back in the 60s, you know, that characterized these people. And the hillbilly, the Cedar Choppers fit into that characterization as far as people could tell. There was a guy named Buddy Brown who rode around Westlake Hills, that rich area of West Austin, on a white horse bareback with a rifle and a rattlesnake hat band around. Show me the next slide. Pardon me. Get a little hoarse here. This is Homer Teague. This is the father of those two kids in front of that shack with his dog, Bill Dog, it's called. Homer Teague would walk all the way from Westlake Hills all the way into South Austin because at one time as a young man he had driven his old Model T into that same store and just wrecked it, wouldn't drive anymore. And Homer Teague was like the characterization of a Cedar Chopper as he got older. Well, listen, I'm about done now. I want to read you one story that I think pretty much, and the book is just full of these kind of stories. This is a story of one of the Teague boys, not Homer, but this is another family of Teagues up there. His name was Jesse Lee Teague, and he'd gone to World War II. He had fought in First Europe, and when they finished with him there, they took him to Japan, and he came back. And I'm going to tell this story how he relates to a lawyer who represented the Cedar Choppers named Emmett Shelton. The bridge that I talked about that I fished at earlier is now named the Emmett Shelton Bridge because Emmett Shelton essentially became the biggest real estate developer in Westlake. And he got a lot of that land from Cedar Choppers, and he got a lot of that land for representing Cedar Choppers in their legal affairs. Emmett Shelton said, poor little fella, he didn't know where he was any of the time he was fighting. So he comes home with PTSD, or battle fatigue as it was called back then, and he moved out to his father's place, Homer's place, or not Homer's place, but his other father, on Bee Cave Road and St. Stephen's School Road to rest and get better. And he bought a goat for a pet. So I'm going to read this story. It's about Emmett Shelton and Homer Teague. Next door to Jesse Teague's place was a place with a little rock house built by Harv Roberts, the son of Henry Roberts, and the brothers of the other people I mentioned. Harv had a job doing mechanical work at the University of Texas, which is not usual for a Cedar Chopper. They usually wouldn't work for wages because they didn't want anybody to tell them what to do. Like them, he was handy with rock work and built a house for himself of rock, but it didn't have doors or windows. There weren't any fences, so pretty soon Jesse Teague's goat made a habit of going over to Harvey's house and going into the kitchen and eating everything he could get his mouth a hold of. And generally when Harvey came home in the afternoon from work, Jesse's goat would be over in the kitchen table. This is Emmett saying this. Harvey would just shoot him off the first couple of times, but he finally hit him with a broom and ran him all the way back to Jesse's place. Jesse said to Harvey, this is Emmett talking, he didn't appreciate him beating on his goat that way. And Harvey said, well, Jesse, you keep your goat at home. He's over here in my kitchen. table and he eats everything up I've got, and I just don't want that to go on. Well, Harvey said, I don't see no harm in my goat being over there on your kitchen table, and I don't want you beating on him no more. The goat was on the table the next afternoon when Harv came home, and Jesse was next door waiting with his rifle to see what Harv would do. When Harv hit the goat with a broom, Jesse fired a warning shot into the house. It was enough to scare Harv into hiding until it got dark, and even then he was afraid to start up his car. So he walked all the way to Emmett Shelton's house in South Austin. He arrived about 9 p.m. and told his story, asking Emmett what he could do about it. This was Emmett's reply. Well, I said, Harvey, you are kin to him, and you know him better than I do. I said, now, you don't have a lot of choice. And go back out there. I believe if you work hard, just right, you can catch old Jesse when he's not looking. You can probably kill him if you get the first shot at him. But I said, now, of course, you know that old man, T, he likes little Jesse. He's been off to war, and he's been a hero so far as the family's concerned. And that old man, he won't like that very well. You're going to have to kill him. You know that for sure. And of course, his mother, she loves little Jesse. You'll have to kill her. And then I said, how many brothers and sisters has Jesse got? They're called the Fighting Teagues, by the way. I know there's Raymond and there's Bert and 2 or 3 sisters, and all of them are pretty good shots. Now, you know as well as I do, Harv, that you're going to have to kill every one of them, or you can just do this. You can either do that, or you can just pick up and leave. And Harvey left. He went back out there, got his clothes, and didn't go back out there, I believe, as long as Jesse lived. So that's all. I'd love to hear any questions or comments you guys have.
All right. Thank you so much for that. So let us, we've got about 10 minutes left. So either I can ask a question or two. Actually, there's one I definitely want to ask before we open it up to the participants. And that is that when you mentioned that you'd attempted to conduct this research a couple of decades ago, that you'd been met with defensiveness and distrust. So what do you think changed to make this project more feasible when you did start it?
I think they came to the resolution of their story. I didn't really try to do it back then, but I don't think I would have met with much trust back then. It was just too raw, you know.
Sure.
I have some. I would finally, after talking with Ronnie and really realizing that this is a serious story, I would say, so how did you feel? Like the guy who was driving past the golf course. I said, how'd you feel about that when people look down on you? You're talking about wearing white shoes and stuff like that. He said, you feel terrible when you don't have no shoes, when your toes are bloody because they've been kicked on rocks, And I talked to Alice Patterson with the little shack there, and she said, so how do you feel what was it like when you went into Austin? People looked down at you? And she said, well, I guess they did. I didn't really think much about it back then. We were proud of what we did.
Mm-hmm.
We worked hard. We made a living, So these were all old people, and they had, I think, had a long time to process this. And they wanted to tell their story. So I was, even after the book came out, I didn't know how people would react to some of the stories are quite violent,
Mm-hmm.
Some of the Cedar Choppers, the Teagues, for instance, some of the Cedar Choppers were pretty bad boys. And a lot of them weren't. And that's what they would say. Well, there were some rough ones among us. So I was a little afraid of that. So what I did is I took a copy of the book and I gave it to all of the Cedar Choppers that I interviewed.
Mm-hmm.
And Luther Pierce was, the one I mentioned that I was kind of afraid to even talk to, because he would have said, Kenny, we weren't friends back then. What do you want to talk to me now for? I was afraid of some reaction like that. Like I said, he was a very, very kind man. And so I gave him a book. It was really wonderful to talk to him. And had lots of stories. And the cool thing was then I had his mom, Edna Patterson, on tape from the 1970s at the Austin History Center. And then I had his stories too, telling the same story or versions of it,
Mhm.
And he calls me up, called me up like a month later, and he said, "Kenny," real low voice, "Kenny, I really like your book." I
Aw.
said, "Man, Luther, that means a lot. That means a lot coming from you. That really means a lot." He said, "Them boys you met out there on the Lake Austin when you were fishing?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I think that was me and my cousin Charlie." So you talk
Oh,
about coming full circle.
oh, absolute. That's an amazing story. And one more real quick before I open it up. So, how did you go about determining which questions you asked in your interviews? Did you have a set of questions you asked each interviewee, or did each person warrant their own set
No,
of specific questions?
no, not at all.
Okay.
I went in blind. I went in blind and I followed their leads. Not at
Sure.
all. No set questions. And like I said, I started asking lots tougher questions. And like, how do you feel about that, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Started asking the tough ones, and just it was all good. It's all good. Depending on who I'm talking to, those was for the Cedar Choppers. I talked to lots of ranchers too, who would employ Cedar Choppers, and I talked to townspeople like in Liberty Hill, and they're all different. The townspeople were really suspicious of them. They didn't like them at all. They wrote a book about Liberty Hill, which is out west of Austin, for you guys who don't know. In the Cedar Hills, there's a book written in the 1960s of cultural history or something of Chinook Ridge folk. I'm going, man, this has got to be great. I'm going to hear about the Cedar Choppers from the townspeople back in the 60s or 70s. They're going to really learn something about it. But they didn't even mention them. They didn't even mention them. They wouldn't talk about them. They talked about all the good Bible thumping, people who went on to become doctors and lawyers and stuff like that, and they just obliterated their history. So I think part of it was that they wanted their history. It was a unique history, truly unique people, and so I think they kind of were a little proud of the way they had grown up in their own way.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
ranchers, I was going to say though, the ranchers had a lot of respect. The ranchers had a great deal of respect for them. There's a guy in Barnett that owned a hardware store and pretty famous there. And I have to talk about a hard question. I'd say, so you're talking him up. You're acting like you really respected him. How would you feel about one of them marrying your daughter? And he said, I think I'd have to grit my teeth on that one.
Hmm. Well, all right. Well, we're going to open it up. Margaret, if you'd like to start that.
Righty, so if you have any questions or comments for our author, please dial *9 if you're calling in from a phone, or by pressing Alt-Y if you're using your computer to raise your hand and join the queue to share your thoughts. We'll be monitoring the queue, so please wait until you're called on to unmute yourself and begin speaking. When we call on you, you may unmute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone or by pressing Alt-A on your computer. You'll be asked to give your first name and the city you're in if you'd like, and then you can ask your question. You will be muted again after you've made your comment.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. Sally, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes. First of all, I very much enjoyed the book. I had never heard of how anybody made charcoal. It was just totally fascinating to me. Did you actually see them do this?
No, I didn't. But I had a guy, one of the Boatwrights, the brother of Dick Boatwright, the son of Dick Boat, who gave me a detailed explanation of how they do it. And the kids would all do it too. That you could employ the whole family. And yeah, they'd be barefoot, burning charcoal. Yeah, and that's fascinating, isn't it? And they sold it for 25 cents a bushel in Austin or San Antonio or New Braunfels or anywhere along the hill country.
My whole experience with
Where,
charcoal
where,
is the kind that you put on there on the grill, and I had no idea,
uh-huh.
how you would even
Well,
make something like that, and it just fascinated
I
me.
know, isn't that?
And the other thing, yeah, and the other thing, I grew up in southeastern Oklahoma, and one of the properties we owned had cedar trees on it, and I always loved the smell of those
Uh-huh.
cedars. And you're right; those posts will last until doomsday. Those and bodark. I mean, you can't kill either one of them. The
Uh-huh.
insects just don't
Uh-huh.
destroy them. And those posts that
Yeah.
we put in the ground when I was a kid are still there. And
Isn't that
that was
amazing?
70. Yeah, it was 70 years
Yeah.
ago or more. So yeah,
Huh?
it's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
And
you probably had some hillbillies there in southeastern Oklahoma as well.
yeah, well, it's Choctaw Nation, and they came, of
Oh, okay.
course, from back east. But the the property that we owned that had all the cedar trees on it, it was owned originally by Indians families, and I do not know
Uh-huh.
where those trees originally came from. Um, that did not come with the history of the property, So but it was
Uh-huh.
interesting. And the other thing that
Yes.
you didn't mention is that we paid a small fortune for cedar lined closets and stuff to keep the moths out of our houses, and that kind of
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
And and and
Cedar
and
chest.
and cheater chests that we stored our blankets and stuff in during the summer to keep them
Yes.
safe from
Right.
the moth stuff.
Exactly.
And I don't know,
Yes.
do they make any of that kind of stuff, or is it just strictly the post, or do you know?
I think
It,
they
it,
do. Yes, I think they do. I think in Fredericksburg you could probably find a store or two that sells cedar furniture. This
yeah.
beautiful, gorgeous wood. Gorgeous wood.
Yes, it is. It has all that beautiful color in it. It's just gorgeous. Yes. Okay. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and
Well,
I'm glad
thank you,
you wrote
Sally.
the book. And are
Thank
you
you very much.
planning to write anything else?
I'm not. That's it was a quest. It was a quest. I had to
uh,
who are these people? Where did they come from? So
yeah.
I
It
found
it
out,
was
and it was a
it was fascinating, and I'm surprised that more of them didn't end up dying out there with those axes and stuff. You mentioned the injuries that some of them suffered,
they
and
really, yes, they
yeah,
hurt
I would,
themselves a lot.
yeah, it
Yeah.
must be very dangerous.
I would
Well,
guess
thank
most
you
of
so
it
much.
one time or another. You bet, Sally. Thank you.